Hi again, welcome back. This time we're going to take a look at English Language Paper 1, question 4. It's the big 20-mark question at the end of section A. So by now you've read the extract, you've annotated it, you've had a go at question 1, you've looked at language in a lot more detail for question 2, and you've looked at structure in a lot more detail for question 3. By the time that you get to this particular question in section A, you've already got a very good idea of what is happening in the extract and what is going on linguistically and structurally at different points. So if you're joining me just for question 4, I would strongly recommend watching the videos where I talk through annotation of the extract at the very least, because if you're approaching a question 4 cold as a practice, then you're going to need to spend a bit more time familiarising yourself with the extract. Otherwise, it's not a realistic reflection of what you would be doing in the exam. So if you haven't already, go back and watch my walkthrough videos where I annotate the extract and read it through with you, and at the very least have a very good read of the extract from Rebecca and you'll be ready to go. Question 4 tests your skills for assessment objective number 4, evaluating texts critically. And in that keyword evaluate is all about assessing the effectiveness of a text, assessing how well it achieves its aim. It's not the same thing as saying how good a text is, which is a common mistake that people make, is they think they have to write a review of the extract in question 4. And that's not really what you're being asked to do at all. You're simply answering the question, how effectively has the writer achieved what they set out to achieve when they wrote this extract? And crucially, you can't just state your evaluation yes or no unless you support it with reasons why, because otherwise it's not really an evaluation, it could just be a guess. So you're looking once more at the choices made by the writer, and you can be quite broad. You can talk about language or structure here, and you can talk about any decisions that the writer makes in the part of the extract that you are directed to for this question. In essence, you have to show that you understand and evaluate the writer's language choices. So by evaluate, how successful, and the language choices, words and phrases, structures, terminology. And all of this is with the focus on what it does for you as the reader. Again, if you feel that these questions are difficult to answer because when you read something you don't necessarily feel anything, you don't have an emotional reaction, then once more flipping the question on its head a little bit and asking instead, what does the writer want the reader to feel, or what does the writer want the reader to think when they read this particular part of the text, and how have they tried to achieve that? You also need to be able to identify and explain the tools the writer has used to do this, the writer's methods. So once more, there's a focus on calling things by their proper name and using terminology. And you have to make a clear and relevant response to the focus of the statement. Say, in short, you have to say whether you agree or disagree. So AO4 looks really quite straightforward on the surface of things. It just says from the specification, evaluate text critically and support this with appropriate textual references. It all comes down to our understanding of these key words: evaluate, critically, textual references. Evaluation is all about assessing and understanding the quality and or the success of a text. Now just be careful with that second suggestion there. Once again, you are not writing a review of a source that you are given. You are looking at how well a writer has achieved what they set out to achieve. So if they want us to feel sad, have they achieved that aim? If they want us to feel excited, have they achieved that aim? And that's where your opinion comes in. So being able to say to what extent they have achieved their aims, that is down to you as a reader making an informed choice and being able to say that this text has affected me in these ways and in these ways, not so much in these ways. And it's all about responding to a statement that you're given. So we'll take a look at an example question in a little bit and you'll be able to see what I mean by that. It's not enough just to say, I agree or disagree, or I think the text is absolutely naff. You need to be able to say why. So using quotation and analysed evidence. So although this isn't an AO2 question, you are still expected to look at the quotes that you have selected and to comment on the writer's methods and to comment on how they have achieved their aims or not. So AO4 is not actually that much different to AO2. The only real difference is the fact that you have to evaluate and form an opinion as well as analyse the text. Before you have a go at question 4, I'm just going to give you a piece of advice, and this is something that I say to all of my students every time I teach question 4, and some of my students are absolutely sick of hearing me say this, but I cannot emphasise this enough. In order to get good marks on question 4, you have to show that you can make a clear and a relevant response to the focus of the statement. I'm just going to highlight that word again there, relevant. The whole focus of question 4 is that you are given a statement and you are asked, to what extent do you agree? Please make your life easier for yourself and always agree with the statement. Now, I'm just going to let that sit for a second. Always agree with the statement. It might seem a little bit strange to be asked the question, to what extent do you agree, and then be told that you have to agree. And I completely understand that the normal emotional reaction from any human being when told to do one thing is to do the other. However, I just want to emphasize that there is nothing clever or original about disagreeing. It's not a trick at all. When you're asked to what extent do you agree, it's because the text is constructed in a way that you are supposed to agree. And actually, instead of coming across as clever or original, when you say you disagree, you tend to come across a little bit arrogant. And that is all to do with the fact that writers of fiction, they have an intention when they sit down and write. Anyone who has ever done a piece of creative writing, and I don't mean writing for an exam or writing for an English lesson, I mean true creative writing where you are communicating your point of view or your ideas through your choice of words and choice of structures. You have a very clear idea in your head of what it is you are trying to communicate and what ideas you are trying to convey through your characters, your setting, and the situations. All of those things make up the writer's intention. The skill of fiction writers lies in their use of language and structures, their choice of words and the way they put them together. If you disagree with a statement, you're essentially saying that writers of fiction aren't very good. You're essentially saying that the writer who has written the source for your exam didn't really know what they are doing. That is not the same thing as disliking something. I'm not going to stand here and say that you have to enjoy everything that you are given to read in an English language exam. That's not really what I'm saying. You can dislike it, you can be personally not to your taste, but that doesn't make it bad writing. The two things are not the same. Remember, if this is something that you struggle with, ask yourself the question, instead of how do I feel when I read this, how does the writer want me to feel? What was the point of this piece of text? And bear in mind that these texts have been very carefully selected, and they've been selected because they show a range of methods successfully. If you disagree with the statement, not only do you potentially come across as a little bit arrogant and a little bit overly critical of the writer, you're also going to make your life a lot harder for yourself because the evidence simply won't be there to support disagreeing with the statement. I don't want to feel like I'm banging on about something that you already understand, and you may be sitting there going, yes, I get it, or all right, I'll agree, just move on. But I just want to let that sit there with you for a second, because I give this advice out every time I teach question 4, and every single time I go to mark a question 4, there are always 1 or 2 examples of students who think they know better, who think that they can disagree with the statement and be just as successful. I am not saying that a highly skilled student who is very confident and a competent reader and is able to interpret evidence and analyse and evaluate it very critically, I'm not saying that that student wouldn't be able to disagree and get good marks. All I am saying is that you are making your job much more difficult and potentially shooting yourself in the foot a little bit if you disagree. So if you want an easy life, if you're trying to keep this exam as straightforward as possible, then agree with the statement. So I'm going to shut up about agreeing with the statement for now. This is what a question 4 looks like. And one thing that really frustrates me about question 4 is how it's phrased. So this is an example. Focus this part of your answer on the second part of the source from line 14 to the end. A student, having read this section of the text, said, "This part of the text allows the reader to understand the real sense of unease the character feels. To what extent do you agree?" Now, my frustration with the phrasing of this question comes in to the fact that that's a lot of information to read and process before you can even start looking for the correct answer, let alone answering it in the right way. So what I would recommend that you do with question 4 is, once you've read it and read it carefully, is to just highlight the key points, the key messages in that question, and try and be really selective, because you should be able to turn this into a much more straightforward question. So have a go at highlighting the keywords, see what you think the keywords are, and I'll let you know what I highlighted in a moment. So here's what I highlighted. First of all, the section of the text that the question wants you to focus on. In a second, you've guessed it, I'm going to ask you to draw a box around it. Then the next bit, I'm looking for what it is I'm actually being asked to agree with. So the section about a student having read this section of the text is essentially irrelevant. That doesn't add anything to my question. It's not going to give me anything useful to use in my answer, so I'm going to disregard it. However, what the student did say, that's what I'm being asked to agree with, so I'm going to read that again and look at the key information. You'll notice what I've done is highlighted it so that it should still make sense on its own. I'm just going to reread the highlighted portions and see if the question makes a bit more sense now. Lines 14 to the end, this part of the text allows the reader to understand the unease the character feels. To what extent do you agree? That seems a lot more manageable. That feels like something I can actually use to approach the extract again in terms of what it is I'm looking for and what I'm going to be answering in my question. So that process of highlighting the key ideas and really thinking about what it is you're being asked about, it is worth spending a minute or two on understanding the question before looking at the extract again, and certainly before trying to answer. For question 4, as it's 20 marks, it's worth spending a bit more time on. So I would spend around 20 minutes on this question. Now, bearing in mind, depending on how long you spent on questions 1, 2 and 3, you might need to adjust this because you're aiming to spend no more than an hour in total on section A. So what I would do I get into the exam is make a note of the time in which I need to move on to question 5 by. So what time do I absolutely have to have finished question 4 by? And starting question 4 no later than 20 minutes to spare. In practice, once you're used to doing this in timed conditions, I find that most students are able to claw back around 5 minutes for question 4 just from being able to read and annotate quickly and being able to get question 1 out of the way quickly. So if you can buy yourself back some time, that's great, but if not, aim to spend around 20 minutes. It's worth 20 marks, so it seems like a long time, but it is well worth it. Remember, it's worth half of section A and a quarter of this paper overall, which means this one question is worth an 1/8 of your GCSE for English language. Please do not disregard it and don't rush it. You're much better off spending the time on question 4 than spending longer on question 2 or question 3. So by now you should be used to this method. Find the lines that you've been asked to focus on and draw a box around them. Normally question 4 will ask you to focus on the second half of the extract, so you should just be able to draw a line from the first line and then move on. And because this is the final question based on the extract, once you have isolated the lines that you are looking at for question 4, you can pretty much ignore and forget everything that happened in the rest of the extract because, as ever, comments on lines outside the named ones are not creditable in the question. So find the lines that you've been asked to focus on and draw a box around them. And once more, especially now that you have read the extract several times, look at what is already highlighted. Annotate your ideas around it if you have space left. I actually found that I was running out of space. And this time, when you're annotating, do so with a focus on the focus of the question. So for this particular example, we're looking at how the writer has created a sense of unease for the character. And once more, make sure you've got a grip on the writer's method. So what terminology can you use here? What terminology can you identify? So now would be a good time to pause the video and go back to the extract and start annotating for question 4. If you need a little bit more support on this, I have done a video walking through an annotation and a very quick plan of an answer to question 4, so do take a look at that if you would like. If not, pause the video, annotate away, and come back and we'll look at structuring your answer, and then I'll give you some time to answer the question yourself. So there are some quick wins for question 4. And the first thing to do is to make sure that you respond to the statement straight away in a very clear and unambiguous way. Simply writing the words, "I agree with the statement," or something possibly a bit more complicated, "I agree that the writer shows the character feeling uneasy," just that is enough to credit you with 1 mark before you even explain anything, because the marks, according to the mark scheme, as long as you have attempted a response to the focus of the question, it's creditable with at least a level 1 simple comment. So you can almost write the words "I agree" before you've even annotated the text, and certainly before you've thought about much else. Obviously, it's not going to make the biggest difference on its own, just those 2 words, but it is a free mark that you can get without even thinking about it. So I would suggest starting off with a very clear response, something very straightforward along the lines of, I agree with the student's statement. So question 4 is essentially a short essay. And writing a clear essay response is all about making sure that each paragraph is well structured and counts towards your answer. Each paragraph should link back to the focus statement and the evidence from the extract. The easiest way to do this is to form topic sentences that clearly answer the question. So something that I encourage all my students to do is to answer the question in a single sentence. How has the writer made the character feel uneasy? The writer has made the character feel uneasy because, or the writer has shown that the character is uneasy because. And starting each paragraph with a nice clear topic sentence like that, make sure that your answer is easy to follow and that it answers the question, which is obviously a very crucial part of a good essay. In this example, you're looking for any evidence to show that this section of the text shows the main character feeling uneasy. I would aim to find around 4 to 5 pieces of evidence, which would give you 4 to 5 nice clear topic sentences that you can use to answer the question. Once you've found your 4 pieces of evidence, you also need to have something to say with regard to the writer's method in that quotation. So what is going on in terms of language or structure in the quotes that you've chosen, and how do they show that the character feels uneasy there? And again, you can see an example of how I plan an answer to question 4 in my walkthrough of the annotation. And you can see that I've got 4 different points to make, 4 clear topic sentences and 4 pieces of evidence at least. That's how I would go about structuring my answer to question 4. It's nice and easy to remember, 4 and 4. 4 points, 4 pieces of evidence, 4 methods. So I think you're ready now. We've talked about approaching question 4, we've talked about structuring. Hopefully you've annotated or watched the video of me annotating the extract from Rebecca. It's time for you to have a go. Pause the video and have a go at question 4. Time yourself once again and give yourself no more than 20 minutes to answer the question. Make sure your response to the statement is clear and use evidence in each paragraph that demonstrates the writer's methods. So pause the video, set a timer for 20 minutes and have a go at question 4. When you're ready, come back and we'll go through the mark scheme again and we'll go through some example student answers and I'll show you how you can do a bit of self-assessment to see how you're getting on. Pause the video now and come back when you've had a go at question 4. Good luck. I'll see you in a bit. Hey, welcome back. So you've had a go at question 4, you've hopefully timed yourself for 20 minutes and you've got your own answer that you can take a look at now alongside these example student responses to which we'll apply the mark scheme. So by now you should be fairly familiar with how the mark scheme works in terms of the levels that I've been talking about. Level 1, simple, level 2, sum, level 3, clear, and then level 4, perceptive. Those are the kind of key terms that an examiner will use when they're reading an answer to ask themselves whether the answer belongs in a particular level. So the first major difference with question 4 is that obviously we're looking at a different skill. This time we're assessing AO4. And because it is worth 20 marks, you'll also see that the spread across a level is much broader. So we're no longer talking 1 or 2 marks, we're talking about 5 marks each way, which in some ways gives you, I think, a bit more wiggle room. So in some ways it makes the mark scheme a little bit kinder. And I think that's because where there's a spread of 5 marks rather than 2, you're able to demonstrate a range within a level. So what I mean by that is that there is very, very simple, for example, or there's simple moving towards some. Or, for example, there's definitely some evaluation going on and it is almost clear. And that just makes it a little bit easier for you to demonstrate the full range of your skill in AO4. So once again, here are 3 sample student answers, and because question 4 is a long one, it's a 20-mark question, I haven't given you full example answers, I've given you extracts, snippets from student answers. So pause the video and read the sample from each student's answer. I've tried to pick representative examples so that these paragraphs demonstrate the kind of ability that the rest of the answer also demonstrated. But have a good, careful read of each one. And you've guessed it, I'm going to ask you to rank them from the highest marks to the lowest marks and start thinking about why. Pause the video and read each one, rank them, and then come back and we will go through the answers. So you've read them, you've ranked them, let's take a look at how they did. shouldn't come as a great surprise because it's fairly obvious, just given the length and the kind of vocabulary that's used in it, that student B was the highest scoring answer in that selection, followed by student C, and achieving the lowest marks out of that sample was student A. So once again, what I've done with the mark scheme is I've colour-coded the different sub-skills, but this time for AO4. You'll notice that for AO4, there are more sub-skills, but you'll see that there's actually quite a lot of similarity with AO2. So the first thing we're going to look at, I'm still using the same colour because it's essentially the same skill, and that is the evaluative comment on the effect on the reader. So we're still looking at the effect, how the writer's language and structural choices make the reader feel. We're still looking at that same key skill. And we're also still looking at the writer's methods. The bullet point has moved up one, so I don't know whether that suggests it's more important here, but I do think it is intrinsically linked to being able to comment on the effect on the reader and being able to make a critical comment. So being able to comment on how that effect is created in terms of writer's methods, that's language and structure again in your use of terminology. Once again, it's important to remember that you can't just form a critical opinion without any evidence whatsoever, so you are still expected to be able to make textual reference, quotation, and to be as selective and judicious as possible when you are doing so. And then the new skill that is introduced here as part of AO4 is responding to the focus statement. So that statement made by the reader or that statement made by the student who read the text, that this section of the text made the character feel uneasy. You need to demonstrate that you are responding to that and saying to what extent you agree with that statement. And once again, you can see that it's the same skill in each level. It's just the difference between simple, some, clear, and then you've got convincing and perceptive and critical. So let's take a look at student A. I disagree with the statement because the writer doesn't really tell us how the character is feeling. The writer talks about the driveway being positive, which doesn't make me think the character is uneasy at all. It says the drive was a ribbon now, which is a positive image and doesn't make me think she's unhappy. It's a very brief extract from a student answer, as you can see, but let's just start with what they have done and what marks they have achieved. So in pink, I've highlighted the comments on effect. Hopefully you'll agree these are quite simple. Doesn't make me think the character is uneasy at all. It is an evaluative comment. It is engaging with the question and it is thinking about the effect on the reader, but it's doing so in a very, very straightforward and simple manner. The student isn't saying why they don't think the character is uneasy. It's just a statement, and it's a statement that's very easy for someone else to come in and say, well, actually, how about this? Have you considered this? Have you thought about this? That's kind of the weakness of this answer, is that it's open to interpretation and it's open to being pulled apart by a stronger argument. In terms of evidence, we've got one quotation in there, the drive was a ribbon now. It is there, it's a quotation, but it is just the one, and it is very simple. It's not necessarily integrated into their answer particularly well, and I don't get the sense that it adds to the answer all that much. In terms of terminology or writer's methods, the only thing that can really be said for this answer is that there is an awareness that the writer is making a deliberate choice. That word talks, though, is a little bit problematic, as the writer isn't talking at all, they are writing. However, the meaning that the student's trying to communicate is that the writer has chosen language about the driveway. So it does demonstrate the student's understanding that the writer has made a deliberate linguistic choice, but it's limited. It doesn't show understanding of the methods the writer has used, simply because it's using the word talked rather than describes. And also, it's not linked to the specific evidence that it uses later on in the answer, and it's not linked particularly to effect either. And then in terms of the final skill for AO4, the response to the statement, you can see this person has responded, I disagree, and then at the end they've come back to that idea of doesn't make me think she is unhappy. So there is a simple response to the focus of the statement. That last statement there, doesn't make me think she is unhappy, actually demonstrates that the student has started to interpret the question a little bit, because they haven't used the same word uneasy, they have interpreted what they understand by the word uneasy. So this student has responded to the focus of the statement, albeit in a fairly limited way that, again, would need a lot more elaboration in order to bring the marks up. So with all of that in mind, this student achieves around 5 out of 20, which is at the top, to be fair to them, it's at the top level of level 1. But just remember, this is an extract, so I've awarded it 5 out of 20, assuming the rest of the answer is of a similar standard and assuming that they also go on to talk about something different in the same way. It's very difficult to mark just one short extract of an answer reliably, so just take this mark with a pinch of salt, and I always find it's more useful anyway to think about an answer in terms of what level it is rather than what mark it is, because if you're able to think about the mark scheme in that way, then you know you're able to pick out your targets a lot more easily, and you will know, if you can understand the difference between simple, some, clear and perceptive, then you're onto a winner in terms of improving your own answers. So just be wary of that mark, but it is certainly a level 1 answer. So what could this student have done to improve? First of all, the evaluative points show limited understanding of the implicit meanings. Things like telling us that the driveway is positive and the character isn't uneasy at all, actually to me tells me they haven't really understood the extract. Perhaps this person has either rushed their reading of the extract, or perhaps they simply haven't really understood some of the language. That is partly why AO4 isn't assessed until question 4, and that's because the skills kind of spiral on from each other throughout this exam paper. By the time you get to question 4, you should have read the text enough times to be able to look at both those implicit meanings as well as the explicit ones. But this student gives off the impression that perhaps they've only understood the very explicit meanings, the very obvious meanings in the text, and they haven't been able to read layers of meaning like metaphor or connotation, for example. In terms of evidence, the quotation is used accurately, but the inference is basic, and again, it shows only a very surface understanding of the text. So being able to draw the inference, the drive was a ribbon now, being a positive image. Yes, okay, if you take that quote in isolation, ribbon, as we discussed in my video on annotating for question 2, ribbon has positive connotations, yes, but if you then take the quote in its entirety in context in the paragraph, the drive was a ribbon now, a thread of its former self. And actually that juxtaposition of the ribbon and the thread tells us a lot more about the driveway than just that it's positive. That is actually quite a complex reading of the text, and this student hasn't really joined the two things together. So again, this is an example of a student who maybe struggles to read for implicit meanings or for metaphorical meanings. Once again, I did mention this earlier, there is an awareness that the writer has made a deliberate choice, but there is no explicit mention of what method is used. So something even as simple as changing that phrase from the writer talks about to the writer has described the driveway would have taken them just that little bit further through the range of skills. But it is really important that this student has still shown an awareness of the writer making a deliberate choice. That's a very easy thing to do because you simply try and use the phrase the writer at some point during your answer, and you're making that distinction between this being a true story or this being a series of facts to this being a construct that the language that you are reading has been carefully chosen by an individual and put together to create a particular image in your head or to create an idea in your head. And when you come to the response to the statement, this student has committed the cardinal sin of disagreeing with the statement. And this is exactly what I was talking about earlier when I was giving you the advice that it is so much easier to agree. You'll see that actually the evidence they've chosen doesn't back up their point at all. If they're disagreeing with the statement and essentially telling me that the character is very happy in this extract, the evidence simply isn't there, because the evidence all throughout the extract is that the character is unhappy. The character doesn't like the changes that she sees, and that she's confused and that she's a little bit bewildered by everything that's in front of her. So the two things just don't marry up. Disagreeing with a statement and being able to provide evidence for it just doesn't work. And they've only really interpreted the one thing. Again, that comes back to what this answer would achieve overall. It would only achieve 5 out of 20 if the student is able to develop their points a little bit and to say something else about why they disagree with the statement. I think they've actually got a very tough job ahead of them to get that 5 out of 20, because like I keep saying, the evidence simply isn't there. This student potentially wouldn't even achieve the 5 out of 20 that I've written down here if the rest of their answer just rehashes the same point, that the character isn't unhappy because they like the driveway. So this will hopefully serve as a cautionary tale for you in terms of why it is so important to agree with the statement. And in the other examples, we'll talk about to what extent you have to do that, because you don't have to agree completely 100%. However, disagreeing 100% is very dangerous because you are severely limiting what you can do with your answer. So that was student A. There's quite a lot there that you can use as examples to improve your own work, and also as kind of ideas of how you can get very simple marks quite easily on this question. So student B, this is the answer that we said achieved the highest marks, and you can see the difference simply in length between student A and student B is really quite stark, given that this is still just an extract of a student answer. So let's have a read of student B's answer and see what they have done particularly well here. I agree with the statement. The writer clearly shows the protagonist's unease throughout the section of the extract, building an insidious semantic field through the use of sinister adjectives, stealthy, dark, strange, and unnatural. Throughout this section of the text, the reader gains an impression of Manderley as a shell of its former self. Du Maurier successfully creates a sense of unease for the reader through repeated juxtaposition of imagery. The archway of a church ought to be a positive image, however it is formed from the naked limbs of the trees in a strange embrace. The noun phrase exaggerates this juxtaposition as the adjective strange alters the meaning of the noun embrace, creating an impression for the reader that things are not what they should be. It seems clear that Du Maurier's protagonist has strong positive association with Manderley, describing it as a jewel and alluding to things of culture and grace in our time, thereby further emphasising the metamorphosis that Manderley has undergone. The unease the character feels at this change is brought to a climax when Du Maurier reveals her protagonist's own feelings of uncertainty and unease at the change. My heart thumping in my breast, a strange prick of tears behind my eyes. Even here, Du Maurier repeats her earlier motif by using the adjective strange, once more making clear reference to the discord the protagonist feels between what is and what ought to be. The reader, in turn, feels a reflection of the narrator's unease through Du Maurier's choice of language. It's a little bit like our examples for question 2 and 3, that the highest scoring answer is really very impressive. Once again, you don't need to even start really colour coding to just get a sense that this student has got a very advanced vocabulary, they've got a very deep understanding of writer's methods, and they've certainly understood the text. They've certainly read it a number of times and thought about what happens in each section very carefully and how the writer has made choices to create effects. So starting with the effect on the reader, again, you can see there's a lovely spread. It's quite balanced throughout the entire extract of this answer, that the student keeps coming back to this idea of what the writer has done for the reader, or what the text has done in terms of creating an image for the reader. There's a clear sense that there's some evaluation going on. They are actually considering to what extent an effect is created. For example, if we look in the middle of the extract from this answer, this creates an impression for the reader that things are not what they should be, and it seems clear that Du Maurier's protagonist has strong positive associations with Manderley. And then jump a line, it goes to further emphasising the metamorphosis that Manderley has undergone. So they're actually talking about two separate effects, but linking them together, and they're talking about the strength of that effect. So that is a really lovely piece of evaluation there, and it's a nice critical comment where it's clear that the student has considered the language and thought about the level of effect that it has on them as a reader. Once more, as is becoming a pattern with the strongest answers that we have looked at, the evidence is very wide-ranging, and most of it is quotations of single words or a couple of words at a time. Once again, showing that judicious, selective pickiness that examiners really love to see in the top-level answers. Once again, also embedded very securely into the sentences. They're synthesizing that information, and they are transforming Du Maurier's words into their own, and they're making those words work for them rather than having to squeeze them in. It wouldn't surprise you at all to show that this is a judicious range. So by now, hopefully you understand what that term judicious means, about being really, really selective and picky, and also not being afraid of using the same quote more than once and saying something different about it each time. That's something that a lot of students overlook as a possibility. They think once they've used it, they have to throw it away. But actually revisiting a quote more than once is often a sign of very close reading and close understanding when it's done well. Just have a look at all of that blue that's appeared on the page just now. So perceptive understanding of the writer's methods, absolutely. They've got a lovely range of varied but relevant terminology. It's not just feature spotting. In particular, if we look at how they have dealt with the phrase strange embrace, they've identified that it's a noun phrase, which is quite a high level piece of interpretation because it requires them to understand both of the word classes for strange and embrace, adjective and noun. But they haven't just labelled, they have then talked about what that noun phrase does on a very basic linguistic level, how the adjective alters the meaning of the noun, and they've implied that has changed the meaning of that entire phrase. And they then brought in another piece of terminology, which is juxtaposition. So that shows a very, very clear understanding of the way the English language works and the whole function of an adjective in a sentence. And they're then linking in effect implicitly. So that is the sort of thing that you would be looking for in a grade 9 student. A noun phrase exaggerates this juxtaposition as the adjective strange alters the meaning of the noun embrace, creating an impression for the reader that things are not what they should be. It just reads very, very fluently. There's no sense that they are forcing this terminology in. It just simply demonstrates that they get it, they understand every single word class very carefully, and they've understood it in context as well. The key to the success of this answer, I think, lies in the fact that almost everything else is a response to the statement. There's a definite sense that they're developing an argument, so this reads a little bit more like a convincing essay. I feel like this student could stand up and defend their point of view if they were questioned on it. So if I were standing there deliberately trying to pick apart their argument, I feel like they would have a lot of different things in their back pocket to argue back at with me. And that's kind of how you want to think about this type of question. You want to be thinking about what would someone else who disagrees with me say, and how can I prove that they are wrong? And you get a very strong sense that this student has thought very carefully about that. Shouldn't come as a surprise that if they were to produce a full answer of this standard, they would achieve 20 out of 20 without a shadow of a doubt. This is a very, very strong answer. And once again, I fail to see what a student really could have done more of in 20 minutes of an exam. So this is a fantastic example of the sort of writing to be aiming for, particularly if you were targeting those top grades, 7s, 8s and 9s. This is the kind of level of writing that you need to be aiming for if possible. What is so good about this answer? I feel like I've talked about this answer a lot, so I'm not going to spend too much longer focusing on this. However, the one thing I will say is that every single word of their answer counts. There isn't much in there that has remained unhighlighted, and that is because every single thing they have written adds to their answer in some way. Pretty much every word is creditable with marks. And once again, that's how you want to be working this exam, particularly if you are aiming for those top grades. You want to make sure that everything you're writing down in some way helps you. You don't want to be wasting time writing words down for the sake of it, because you simply don't have the time in an exam situation to do that. In order to do this, this student has had to have a very, very clear understanding of what is expected. So I would have thought that this was a student who knows the mark scheme very, very well. They know exactly what it means to be a level 4 of the mark scheme. They understand that word judicious. They understand what it means to be perceptive. And in order to do that, they understand that they need to craft their answer very carefully and make sure that every word, every sentence of their answer has to demonstrate those critical, evaluative and perceptive skills. I'm not going to say too much more about their use of quotation and terminology because I've already discussed it at quite a lot of length, but the key for both the quotes and the terminology is that it is all embedded and linked to one another. So you can't really take the terminology out or the evidence out and still have the same standard of answer. The two things go hand in hand. And remember, although these have been separated as different elements of AO4, AO4 is all counted as one skill on the mark scheme. So it just goes to show that to achieve high levels of AO4, you need to be thinking about all 4 strands of the mark scheme. And as I said earlier, they have formed a very strong and very convincing argument. They haven't thought just about one paragraph, they've thought about what they're going to say overall and to what extent they agree with the statement. So overall, a fantastic answer. And finally, student C. So this is the answer that we said was somewhere in the middle of student B and student A. I agree to some extent with the statement. Although Du Maurier makes it clear that the narrator is feeling uneasy through her use of a negative semantic field, stealthy, insidious, uncontrolled, it is not clear throughout this section of the text exactly what the character is feeling. It is not until the climax of the extract that Du Maurier tells the reader what the character's emotions are, my heart thumping in my breast, and even then we are left to infer meaning rather than be told that the character is scared. Overall, Du Maurier's writing is a little confusing, but the reader may be able to guess at the intended effect. So Student C is a really good example of a sort of middle band answer. Take a look at the comments on effect. There's quite a lot going on in a fairly short paragraph, and it's clear their statements make sense. Their statements are unambiguous and they're factually correct, and they're quite difficult to argue against. You would need to have a student of at least the same level kind of throwing arguments back at them for this argument to be pulled apart. It's quite strong, and for that reason it's unambiguous, it's clear. Looking at the evidence, there's a nice selection. There's not too much, there's nothing too long, but certainly a lot more limited than student B was showing. It is still a range because they've been, particularly in that first set of quotations, they've been quite judicious. They picked out individual words, stealthy, insidious, uncontrolled, and it is all relevant, so their quotes link to the points that they have made. Terminology-wise, this is probably something that's holding this answer back just a little bit. Yes, they have labelled a negative semantic field and they have mentioned the climax of the extract. And once again, there is a sense that the writer is making deliberate choices. Du Maurier tells the reader, which should be highlighted as well. However, it feels a little bit like it's been forced in. It feels a little bit like they know they have to include terminology, so they've shoehorned that in without maybe fully understanding how or why the writer has used that particular method to convey that particular idea. And when it comes to the response to the focus of the statement, it's some. Yes, they agree with the statement. They've said this section of the text tells us exactly what the character's feeling, and overall Du Maurier's writing is a little confusing. So it's not as clear as their comments on effect, which just pulls this answer down again a little bit, because I feel like their response to the focus statement would be a little bit easier to pull apart. So because of that, this answer achieves around 12 out of 20, assuming that the rest of the answer is of a similar standard. So it just creeps into level 3. It is a clear answer, but there are elements of it that aren't as clear as others. And once again, in order to secure that level 3 and potentially boost their marks beyond 12, move through that level of the mark scheme, the student would have to develop this a little bit further and to say a little bit more about something different or to explain their points a little further. But this little extract, if it is an accurate snapshot, would achieve around 12 out of 20. So what could they have done? Their points could have been developed a little bit more fully, especially that statement at the end, we are left to infer meaning, is a little bit lazy. What meaning are we left to infer? It wouldn't have taken much just to elaborate on that point a little bit, but it would have secured a stronger level of the mark scheme, because actually the comments on the effect were the strongest part of this answer, and there is a chance the student could advance their marks throughout level 3 a little bit further just by developing their explanation and exploration of effect a little bit deeper. Again, quite lazy quotation, so although they have been quite selective, they've just whacked those quotes in parenthesis rather than trying to use them as part of a sentence. I would say, though, that doing this isn't always a bad thing. You have to feel it out. It's not always appropriate to embed a quote, and sometimes that takes an unnecessary amount of extra time, but it does read a little bit like they're listing. So they've picked out their quotes and they haven't really thought about how they're going to synthesize that information into their answer. They've just whacked them in because they know they have to have evidence. So it's a little bit lazy, possibly. Potentially a student who's a bit rushed for time. Sometimes it's a decision you have to make. If you are running out of time, it's more important to get the evidence in there than to do anything particularly fancy or twiddly with it. However, it's something that would have helped the student to achieve some slightly higher marks. There is some terminology used well, but there's not much linking. So if you compare this answer in particular to student B and look at how they've used terminology, this student has very much labelled it. They followed a structure. They know they have to get the point in there, they have to get the evidence in there, they have to get some terminology in there. They haven't linked the different areas of the skill anywhere near as confidently as student B. And the thing that I struggle with this particular answer is that They are sitting on the fence. It is okay to explore both sides of the argument, but I agree to some extent. This section of the text shows us exactly what the character is feeling. Overall, the writing is a little confusing. There's no sense that this student has actually formed their own critical opinion. They are doing what I think of as sort of table tennis with their argument. They're thinking point to agree, point to disagree, point to agree, point to disagree. And they're just batting it backwards and forwards without actually coming to a conclusion themselves. And that indecisiveness doesn't demonstrate what AO4 is looking for, because remember, AO4 is asking you to evaluate texts critically. So this student has started to evaluate, but they haven't been critical. They haven't actually decided what it is they think about the text. So because of that, it brings the answer down a little bit, but overall, still 12 out of 20, it is a level 3 answer. It's certainly not a terrible answer. And in terms of average marks, it's over 50% of question 4. So what I would like you to take away from the 3 sample answers that we've looked at is there are different ways to approach the question. And you should know your strengths and your areas of development really well by now. And if you don't, definitely speak to your English teacher and ask for some detailed feedback about which areas of each assessment objective do you need to work on. And then come back to these model answers and look again at the spread of the skills, because you should be able to pick out which colour, for example, you need to be developing a little bit more. So I think it'd be a good idea now for you to go through your own answer and use the same principles to mark your attempt at question 4. And I think for AO4 in particular, the colour coding system can be very, very useful, because in order to colour code your own answer, you need to have a really good grasp of what each individual strand of AO4 actually is. This was a really useful exercise for me as a teacher, colour coding students' work, because I had to think very carefully, particularly the difference between the pink and the orange. What is the difference between a comment and effect and a response to the focus of the statement? If you can be really reflective of your own work and link it constantly back to the mark scheme, the next time you come to do a question 4 or any AO4 skill, you will find the whole process much more straightforward, because you'll know exactly what you need to do and what the answer should look like. So thanks for joining me on this walkthrough of English Language Paper 1 Question 4. That brings us to the end of Section A of the English Language Papers. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to pause the work on Paper 1 for now, and I'm going to go through and produce some videos on Section A of English Language Paper 2. So just keep an eye on my channel. I will continually upload videos as I make them, and keep the feedback coming in, because if there's anything in particular that you feel you would like a little bit more on or a little bit less of, then let me know and I will adjust my videos as required. Once more, good luck with your revision. If you have any questions at all, tweet me at CollinsK English, and have a lovely day. Thanks a lot. Bye now.